The Joe Budden podcast hosts air each other out, but what has changed and what remains the same?
You know how much mid you be serving in the streets?
You have visceral reactions to that you don't like, and you just literally go scorched earth and act like an insolent child, stomp your feet, and walk the out of here.
Ice mood changes in an instant. Ice will get hot like this. If somebody cracks on Ice's hair, sneakers, Ice will get moody instantly.
As Joe Budden has paywalled some of his best content, many listeners of the show aren't privy to some of the most chaotic moments the show has to offer. Scorched Earth is an episode of the Patreon that was released in January of 2024, with large ramifications for the current iteration of the show. It is in this episode that they seek to evaluate each other, and I think all of them failed, as Mark Lamont Hill would appear just 3 months later as a guest. I truly believe that Joe was fed up with how the show and its participants were conducting themselves on a platform that is only second to the Breakfast Club. It showed that at the core of entertainment, these people are all humans, and they were still trying to figure out how to fit in. Imani had just recently joined the show with great ambitions to change the culture for the better, but several crash outs later, his persona would change.
A grown-ass man. I'm not nobody's little brother. You've never met nobody in my family, so you can't call me a little brother.
In fact, I'm not even going to call them young lady. These shit, I don't wish them any success. I hope their podcast fails. I hope they fail. I hope they don't eat for the next week. I 100% will never mention you niggas again. But don't push no narrative like I'm a yes man and I stuck to a side because it feeding me.
And as a result, he largely became a side character in the JBP universe. Other undertones of the episode persist to this day, with Ish spotlighting how Ice was overtly sensitive and someone the show could not joke around with too much. Joe himself often protects Ice, and so does Parks and many other members of the show. Ice is very sensitive, so they leave him alone, whereas Ish and Flip get ridiculed constantly. Hell, even Flip seems so aware of this point that he would call Ice out for criticizing him when he can't even take any semblance of criticism whatsoever. Another key point of information from this episode is Joe Budden's attempt to launch a show with Melissa Ford and Ish. Yeah, many people may not know that this is what Imani was hinting at in this exchange here.
This is 100% a ship that's running under the guise of his leadership, right? Mm-hmm. He'll present an opportunity for people on this cast to go ahead and have something that's really based off of them and their production and their leadership, like he's saying Yatu.
Who to?
You and Mel.
Even Melissa Ford would highlight in an Instagram live that there was a Ish Melissa Ford show being considered.
No more Ish and Mel pod. Wait a minute. How do you even know that that was even being contemplated? And I'll say it right now. It ain't because of me.
But she wasn't the person who didn't want to do it, which means Ish refused to do the pod with her. Now, that is something that I don't think many people realize. The Joe Budden Network was planning on launching a Melissa Ford and Ish show. What would have been the point of a Melissa Ford and Ish show? Could it have been to expand Joe's network? Or did Joe want to establish a flagship podcast centered on gender wars? Another thing to remember is that Melissa Ford was also supposed to launch a podcast on Joe's network, and even recorded an episode in which she seemingly broke down into tears or something like that, so it could never be released. And one has to wonder why no member of the current cast seems eager to launch a podcast on the Joe Budden Network. Melissa Ford launched Hot and Bothered solo independently, and even Imani's podcast doesn't appear to be on the network. Is it that they don't want to be on the network, or that Joe saw some of his greatest failures come from relying on people he hired? Do other members of the show not want to join the Joe Budden Network because they doubt they will be properly compensated? Let me know what you think in the comments. Ish was also put on blast for his moody approach to podcasting, with many members of the show saying his attitude brings down the vibe of the show. Imani then suggests everyone watch the show in order to understand the show better. But
do y'all go home and watch the podcast?
No.
Everyone dismisses him as a new guy who didn't know what he was getting into.
And Imani has yet to experience this environment in its full capacity.
And time would prove everyone right. Imani was an interesting study for the Joe Budden Network. He came in as a guy who saw all the episodes. So when he got there, he was very critical of everyone on the show, from Ice to Ish. And when he failed to assimilate in a meaningful way, it was clear that he wasn't prepared for the level of visibility that the Joe Budden podcast had to offer. Immediately, the fan base thought he was garbage and also someone who pandered to whatever new persona he tried to create. We all got to remember, man, Imani first started out as the freaky boy, then he was the unemployed boy, then he was a bunch of other things, and over time that wore thin with the audience, so much so that he started to get self-conscious and was afraid of revealing what he actually thought with the fans, and even got in his pandering mode. Still, Joe Budden was in agreement with what Imani said, and it seems to really grind Joe's gears that he is the only one outside of Flip that watches the show. And even a year removed from this episode, that hasn't changed at all, except for a new addition to the podcast, Mark Lamont Hill. I think it's pretty clear to say that not only does Mark Lamont Hill, engage in the podcast, he also watches the episodes later, which gives him a decided advantage over people like Ish and Ice, who don't at all watch the show. Also, Mark Lamont was very much like Imani. He loved the podcast. He rarely missed any episodes, and for a while, I thought that the show was beneath him. But with the way Mark kind of conducts himself, he really feels like Joe Budden with a PhD. This guy loves to go to the shaky butts. He loves the thick joints and the legging words. I mean, I think the Joe Budden Network, the Joe Budden podcast, is something he's heavily invested in staying in. And I also think he believes that everybody on the network isn't taking the opportunity serious, which is why he can come off as snakish. But I really just think he understands what the opportunity presents, whereas everybody else sees it as just a, friendly podcast where everybody works. I mean, if you look at and zoom out, Mark Lamont has really connected with not just Joe Budden, but Ian Schwartzman. Ian Schwartzman and Mark Lamont do whole bits on the behind the scenes. And I don't think Mark Lamont is getting paid for that. I think Mark Lamont just enjoys doing that. And I believe he's about to get his money on the back end because he's becoming someone that the show cannot afford to lose at all. Joe then pivots his sights on Flip and questions him for his lack of preparation, even hinting that Flip doesn't diet well and sleep well. Basically, he's saying, you don't come prepared for the show. You're not getting your 8 hours of sleep. You're not eating the right stuff in order for your voice to sound good and for your mind to be clear. Now, that is something that is largely true about Flip. He relies on energy, which is why his content, at least in terms of thought, has a low ceiling. He doesn't provide thought-provoking information. He doesn't provide thought-provoking dialogue. His go-to is just to get loud, and Joe accurately calls him out. Then, towards the end of this back and forth, Melissa Ford and Flip start shooting at each other, with Ford calling out Flip for his childish ways. A year removed from this argument, Ford and Flip's relationship has vastly changed. Don't you guys remember when Ford and Flip got into it and Flip called out Ford for being a fake, phony lady of the industry? It just kind of shows you that even though time progresses, the relationship between people often degrades. And that was my breakdown of Scorched Earth. I urge anybody to go back and watch it, because if you do, you will see why Joe felt the need to add Mark Lamont Hill. And he was even on Twitter Spaces sounding so desperate to be relieved of having to rely on friends who didn't value his platform.
I'm going to work my way to a real rotating cast. What two people should get fired from Mark Lamont? Everybody had something to do in July. Flip had just got back from suspension. Maybe when Mel had going on, then Ish takes a vacation, and then maybe like it was a lot happening. Rhythm is gonna when you don't have the books, you got to make board no matter what. And that's what it is. So got lives outside of this thing. So, and it'd be a lot going on. So me, I got to stop and think about it no matter what's going on in life. Everybody don't have to do that.
And there you have it. This current version of the show can be seen as needed as a result of what existed back then. I know many will say, Danny, why are you doing a full video about something that happened over a year ago? Well, I think you have to go back to look forward. And I don't think Imani launching a podcast is just because he wants to launch a podcast. I firmly believe that he knows his position at the Joe Budden Network isn't the most solid, so he has to develop his own IP. And isn't it interesting that Imani is launching on Patreon? He said it on Behind the Scenes, and I wonder how that will play out for him, as getting people to pay for your content is one of the most difficult feats that any creator will have to go through. All right, y'all, that's my video about this subject for now. I'm trying out this new thing where I make longer videos and drop less unless something crazy happens. Like I'm telling you, if Joe fires Ish or anything like that, I will be dropping 4 or 5 times a day. But right now, I'm trying to do longer form content in order to truly deep dive on episodes and really get to the science of issues plaguing the Joe Budden podcast, the Rory and Maul podcast, the Breakfast Club, Charlemagne, and much, much more. I want to end this video by saying, please subscribe to my Patreon. My full episode with Rocky Thunder, Shammy, and Evan is up there. We also have countless hours of Twitter Spaces really documenting the drama that's going on the streets of Twitter. It's really ugly. It's really messy. It's really chaotic. But most important, it's entertaining. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter once again, The Stop TV. This is Danny from The Stop. Have a good day, y'all.